Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for February the 4th. Today we're reading together in Genesis chapter 41, which is going to tell us of Joseph's rise from the dungeon and into the second chariot of Pharaoh himself. An incredible story here. As we read through that, we'll read the text together, make a few observations, and then notice how this chapter is really foreshadowing a great deal of so much of what's going to take place in the rest of Scripture, showing the pattern of God being able to take people from very lowly means into the most highly exalted means. We'll notice that as we get through toward the end of our reading together today. Again, thanks so much for taking some time on your Saturday to read along with me. We're making our way through Genesis, only have a few more chapters in Genesis before we get into Exodus, which will be a really cool read. I really enjoyed going through Exodus a few years ago. A friend and I, during the COVID lockdown, did some readings together from the Old Testament, just to walk through kind of like what we're doing in our daily Bible reading. And I remember going through that and really enjoying that read. And I know there'll be a great read for us as well. So reading here together in Genesis chapter 41 and verse number 1, this is picking up 2 years after Joseph had been forgotten by the chief cupbearer, whom he had helped by interpreting the dream, giving him some hope of being restored to his position. He asked that man to please show kindness to me and remember me, because I've been kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews and I'm not even supposed to be here. And yet the cupbearer forgot him there in that moment. Well, we're going to see how conveniently this man remembers Joseph and is able to get him into a position where he can help even Pharaoh with some dreams that he has. So reading here together in Genesis chapter 41, in verse number 1, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. And then Pharaoh woke up, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. Then Pharaoh woke up and realized it was only a dream. When morning came, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, how conveniently, sure he was wanting nothing out of this at all. But he says to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was there with us. Excuse me. This young Hebrew slave of the captain of the guards was with us there, and we told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said that you can hear a dream and interpret it. I am not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile and grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, weak, very sickly and thin, came up. I've never seen such sickly ones as these in all the lands of Egypt. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. When they had devoured them, you could not tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 good ones. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams mean the same thing. The 7 thin, sickly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind are 7 years of famine. It is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance of the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. So now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so that they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. And then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. Verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And he said to them, "Can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's spirit in him?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I, as king, will be greater than you." Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "See, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt." So Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in his second chariot, and servants called out to him, "Make way." So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest at On. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it in the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest at On, bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family." And the second son he named Ephraim and said, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was a famine in every land, but in the whole land of Egypt, there was food. When the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told Egypt, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." Now the famine had spread across the whole region, so Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land, including we're going to see up in the land of Canaan. And that concludes Genesis chapter 41. So looking at the opening of this text, there 2 years after Joseph is forgotten by the cupbearer, he remains in the prison for these 2 years. And then Pharaoh has some dreams, and in these dreams he sees cows, 7 of them specifically, 7 being a number of fate, and cows often representing the abundance of a nation. So to see 7 plump cows seems to mean things are going well. For there then to be sickly cows would seem to mean that things are not going well. The fact that the sickly cows eat the healthy cows really makes things not seem well. And the whole image is repeated, but with heads of grain in the second dream. He has these dreams and he's disturbed by them, and it makes sense to have 2 dreams that are so similar in nature and where very drastic things happen. We can understand Pharaoh's being disturbed by these dreams. So he calls all of the magicians, all the wise men, and tells them, hey, you need to tell me what's going on. I'm sure they had some answer, but their answer was not satisfactory. He was not satisfied with what they said. And of course, that would make sense that these pagan God worshipers would not have the ability to interpret a dream sent by Yahweh. So it is at this point that the chief cupbearer just so happens to remember Joseph at this time. He tells Pharaoh about what took place previously, and then Joseph is called to come and to meet Pharaoh. But before that, he is shaved, which would have been necessary. Semitic type of people were much more willing to have longer hair or beards, looking kind of like me, I guess, whereas Egyptians were known for being very clean shaven. They were not fans of hairy heads or hairy faces. So he's shaved, and then there are clothes that are put on him. He goes to Pharaoh. This begins the transition of Joseph really beginning to look like an Egyptian in very many ways. We're going to see it again later on in verse number 42. But here, Pharaoh introduces himself to Joseph and tells him about what is going on. And he says, I hear that you can interpret dreams, but Joseph deflects that attention away from himself and toward God. He says, no, it is God who is the one who is able to interpret these dreams. So Pharaoh tells the dreams to Joseph. Joseph listens to the dreams and then reveals and says, once again, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And he tells about what these dreams mean concerning there's going to be years of plenty and abundance. Then there's going to be years of famine and people going without. And then Joseph takes it a step further and begins to offer solutions for what could be done. And I'm not exactly convinced that Joseph was thinking that he would be the man to do all these things. And more so, I'd probably think Joseph was just hoping that, by giving him this good interpretation, and once it comes to fruition, maybe he'd be set free at that point. But be that as it may, he gives Pharaoh this advice, offers these solutions. And the text says that the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And he said, you're that guy. You're that guy. Can we find anyone like this? A man who has God's spirit in him. I don't believe he's referring to Yahweh here. Pharaoh would have been very polytheistic in his mindset. So he just thinks that Joseph has the gods, lower G gods, within him and able to interpret this dream. So he says, well, since God has made everything known to you, you're going to be this person. You're going to be the one that's in charge of this project. You're going to be the one who is over all of Egypt. So he goes and gives him a signet ring. He clothes him once again. He places a gold chain around his neck. He puts him in the second chariot. He parades him around, but then he really finishes off the naturalization process really of Joseph, making him an Egyptian, because more than likely Egyptians probably would not have appreciated having this straight up foreigner now being a ruler over them. So we've shaved Joseph, we clothed Joseph, we put the ring on him, the gold chain on him, we put him in the chariot. We're also going to give him a wife. And that's what happens, giving him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, also giving him an Egyptian name. So really, he is just gaining a lot of authority in Egypt, but also beginning to look more like Egyptians so that he might be accepted more by Egyptians. So at this point, he is going throughout the land. He's doing all this, and the text tells us that he is able to compile all this food and grain and such during the 7 years of plenty. He stores it up so that they'll have food during the 7 years of little. And the text tells us that so much that he couldn't even measure it anymore. We're also told there were 2 sons that were born to Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh meaning God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. That's interesting Maybe Joseph during this entire time was thinking that his father, this powerful Jacob, with all these sons and servants and fighting men, would come down and get him, because he doesn't know everything that's taking place. He doesn't know about the shredded garment and blood. He doesn't know about his father thinking that he's been devoured by an animal. And at some point, maybe Joseph had just given up hope that Jacob would come to him. So now that he has a position of authority and power and influence, now that he has a wife, now that he has a son, Joseph says, well, I have this son now, and God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. He's helped me to forget home. He's helped me to forget those people who seem to have abandoned me and who don't seem to be coming after me. Well, then he also has Ephraim, and this is God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. I really like it better here because I have things here and I'm taken care of here and I have a role and I seem to be doing some good here. Certainly God had made him very fruitful in Egypt, even in the moments where things had seemed very difficult. The text finishes up by telling how everything that Joseph had predicted does end up coming to pass, and everything goes smoothly. During the times of abundance, they compile the additional food. During the times of little then and famine, they're able to sell the food not only to Egyptians, but also to others from other lands, which is where Joseph's family is going to come back into the picture again in chapter 42. But just thinking about this is a true rags to riches story. This is incredible. It's incredible to see this man who went from the dungeon to the palace, and not just to the palace, but to second in all of Egypt. And yet that is a story that we see God telling time and time again throughout Scripture. Think about Israel. Israel goes from being escapees in Egypt to being a powerful nation in their own land. Think of Jacob. Jacob going from being a shepherd within his father's house to being king over all of Israel. Think even of Jesus. Jesus going from a manger to being the exalted Lord and King at the right hand of God. Yet all this is not due to the ability of men, although we can say Jesus maybe doesn't fall into the category as good as others, but all this is done because of what God allowed them to do and what God prospered them to do. So as much as we might want to be impressed with what Joseph has done, Joseph would even tell you, as he did throughout the story, that God is the one who gives interpretations. God is the one who revealed this to Pharaoh. God is the one who made all this possible. We need to recognize that as we're reading through the narrative of Scripture, we need to continually be impressed by what God is doing. Excuse me. God is the one who is making all of this possible. God is the one who is providing the way for these people and nations to be exalted from low positions to very high positions. And that certainly applies to us too, that God has taken us, broken, wretched sinners, and through the sacrifice of Jesus has made us adopted sons and daughters of the King. What a wonderful, wonderful thing that God has done for us. And him doing such a thing should be no surprise considering what we see him doing all throughout Scripture. So as we continue to read through this story, I encourage you to continue to recognize just how good God is to his people, just how faithful he is to his promises, and just how much power and influence he has to take people that are nothing and to make them something great. I appreciate you tuning in for this reading on this Saturday. Looking forward to reading with you again in the morning as we read together from, I believe we're going to be in Genesis chapter 42 alone. Let me double check that real fast just to make sure that I am giving the correct information. I should have done this previously. Give me just a second to find my pages here. All right, let's see here. Tomorrow is February the 5th, and we are reading together, from Genesis chapter 42. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow. A quick read before we get to the church house for our Bible studies and worship assembly tomorrow. Again, appreciate you tuning in. Have a great rest of your Saturday, everyone. Take care and God bless.